Hi. Many of you will have heard the phrase, as long as it takes and not one session more. That was Steve de Shazer's standard way of answering questions about what the word brief in solution-focused brief therapy meant, how it was defined. Whenever asked, Steve would answer, as long as it takes and not one session more. And that was his way of distinguishing between brief therapy and time-limited therapy. Time-limited therapy, it's obvious, isn't it? You can have 4 sessions, you can have 6 sessions, you can have 8 sessions. And it's the worker, the therapist, who defines the length of the contract. Whereas in solution focus, actually it's the client who defines the length of the contract, who defines the it. But how do they define the it? That's an interesting question. You could say, perhaps an obvious way to think about it, is that it is defined by the client when they reach their best hopes from the work. But is that necessarily true? Is that necessarily necessary? And I wonder about that. And what occurs to me is that it isn't predefined. It isn't necessarily the achievement of the best hopes. Actually, the it can be and is, I think, potentially co-constructed. Imagine that the worker begins to ask questions of the client, perhaps scale questions. On a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 representing you being absolutely confident that you can make further progress and reach your best hopes, and 0 representing the opposite of that. Where would you see yourself currently? And where would be good enough on that scale? So the it in the process of talking could actually be redefined, not as the moment when the best hopes have been achieved, but actually the point at which the client is confident enough of reaching those best hopes. So it may actually, if redefined in that way, be briefer perhaps than the achievement of the best hopes. But what other questions does that little phrase, as long as it takes and not one session more, actually raise for us? And I think perhaps not a question, but a thought is not one session more. Why would you say not one session more? And I think that begins to get to the heart of how therapy is thought about in solution focus. That therapy isn't, if you like, thought of as a good thing per se. If we think of something as a good thing per se, then obviously the more of it, the better. But here is someone who's saying, as long as it takes and not one session more. So what does that imply? And I think what it implies is that in solution focus, therapy is seen as secondary, perhaps, to lived life. Therapy actually is seen as serving the client in getting on with their living. And the living is the important thing. So in solution focus, I think, we would always see it as, if you like, better for the client to actually be living their life rather than coming to talk to me about that life that they might wish to live. So therapy, in that sense, solution-focused brief therapy anyway, is seen as supporting the client in living life. And the life is seen as more significant and more important than therapy. Therapy is just something that people do until, and is useful, until they potentially unstick themselves in such a way that they can feel confident of getting on with their living, or sufficiently confident of getting on with their living. So I think solution focus points us towards that idea, as long as it takes and not one session more, actually begins to highlight some of the values, some of the beliefs that underpin this particular way of thinking and working. And I think it points us to something else that's in some senses not very convenient for therapists. If we're really going to act on, as long as it takes and not one session more, then I think what that invites us to do is to schedule each session at the end of the current session, the next session at the end of the current session. So rather than, when people arrive, setting up 6 sessions or 8 sessions week by week at the same time, if we're really going to be, as it were, living true to, as long as it takes and not one session more, then we're probably going to be scheduling sessions one by one. At the end of each session, we're going to ask the client, would it be useful to come back? Or have you got out of this everything you need? Because if we schedule 6 sessions, it's massively more likely that the client, being polite, enjoying the therapy probably, people do, will end up having more sessions than it takes. And so in solution focus, actually it's a client-centric way of scheduling. Each time we schedule the next session. And each time, if the client does choose to come back, we're thinking with the client, when might it be useful for that client to come back? And typically, of course, the gaps between sessions get longer as clients make changes. This is hideously inconvenient for therapists. It really is. But if we're going to live true to as long as it takes and not one session more, then probably in putting the client central, we will have to inconvenience ourselves.